After our breakup, she sent me a letter, and I need you to understand something right away. Not a text, not an email, an actual letter with a stamp and everything, like we were living in 1987. I opened it standing in my apartment hallway, still holding my keys, and the first line made my stomach drop in a way I didn't expect. I'm pregnant. The second line was even better. It's yours, and we need to talk about co-parenting. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, reading it twice, then 3 times, because my brain was trying to process something that made absolutely no sense. See, there was one tiny problem with her announcement, one microscopic detail that made this whole thing impossible. I'm sterile, completely and permanently sterile, and I have been since I was 11 years old. When I was a kid, I had leukemia, the kind that required aggressive chemotherapy and radiation, the kind where doctors sat my parents down and explained very carefully that saving my life meant sacrificing certain futures. I survived. Obviously, I'm here telling you this story, but the treatment left me with something called azoospermia, which is a fancy medical term for zero reproductive capability. I've had multiple tests over the years, 3 different doctors, 3 different labs, and every single result came back the same. Nothing, not even a trace, not even a chance. So when I read that letter, when I saw her claim that I got her pregnant, my first thought wasn't panic or fear or even anger. It was curiosity, genuine curiosity about what exactly she thought was going to happen next. We dated for 2 years, and looking back now, I can see all the red flags I ignored because I wanted to believe we could work. She was controlling in small ways at first, little comments about my friends or how I spent my time. Then it graduated to bigger things like questioning my decisions about work or money. When something went wrong in her life, it was always someone else's fault, never hers, and she had this incredible ability to twist conversations until I was apologizing for things I didn't even do. The breakup wasn't dramatic or explosive. I just sat her down one evening and told her honestly that I didn't see a future for us, that I cared about her, but we weren't right for each other. She cried. She asked if there was someone else, and when I said no, she seemed almost offended, like she couldn't believe I'd end things just because we were incompatible. I helped her pack her stuff, I drove her to her new place, and I thought that was it. Clean break, move on with our lives. For about 6 weeks, I heard nothing from her, no calls, no texts, no attempts to reconnect. I figured she was processing it her own way, maybe dating someone new, and I genuinely hoped she'd find someone better suited for her. Then that letter showed up, and suddenly I realized the silence wasn't acceptance, it was planning. Here's what made the whole thing even stranger. She knew about my cancer. I told her early in our relationship because it felt like something important to share, something that shaped who I became. I showed her the small scar on my chest from the port they used for chemo. I talked about the hospital stays and how my parents basically lived in that pediatric oncology unit for months. But here's the thing. I never explicitly told her about the sterility because it never came up naturally in conversation. We never had those deep talks about having kids someday. We never got to that stage where you map out your whole future together. And honestly, I always figured if we ever did get serious about it, I'd explain the situation then. So technically, she knew I'd had cancer and aggressive treatment, but she either didn't connect the dots about what that meant for fertility, or she knew exactly what it meant and decided to gamble that I wouldn't have proof. Either way, she was betting on something that couldn't possibly be true, and I couldn't figure out if that made her desperate or just incredibly calculating. I didn't respond to her letter right away because I wanted to think through my next move carefully. Part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was some medical miracle I didn't know about. Some 1 in a billion chance that the doctors missed something. I pulled out my most recent test results from 2 years ago, the ones my oncologist ordered during a routine checkup, and there it was in black and white. Azoospermia, 0 count. Recommendation for assisted reproduction if desired. I sat at my kitchen table with that medical report and her letter side by side, and the whole situation felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into someone else's life by mistake. Finally, I wrote back, keeping it simple and direct. I'll need a paternity test. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't get emotional. I just stated what seemed like a reasonable request given the circumstances. Her response came fast, way faster than the first letter, and this time it was an email, 3 paragraphs of pure outrage about how I could dare to question her, how she'd never lied to me about anything, how I was trying to abandon my responsibilities. The phrase she used that really stuck with me was, "How dare you doubt me?" Like my request for scientific verification was some kind of personal insult, like wanting proof of something biologically impossible was unreasonable. I read her email twice, then I made a decision that would change everything. I contacted my oncologist's office and requested my complete medical history, everything from my original diagnosis at 11 through every follow-up appointment and test I'd ever had. It took about a week to compile, but when it arrived, it was beautiful in its completeness. Treatment records, medication logs, 3 separate analysis reports spanning 15 years, all showing the same result. I scanned every relevant page, put together a PDF with a cover letter explaining the situation very factually, and sent it to her email with a simple message. I am biologically incapable of fathering any child. Any further claims otherwise are medically impossible and legally actionable. I hit send at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. Then I poured myself a drink and waited to see what would happen next. The response I expected was maybe an apology, maybe an angry denial, maybe just silence while she figured out her next move. What I got instead was absolutely nothing. Radio silence. No reply, no phone call, not even a reaction. 3 days went by with zero contact, and I started to think maybe she'd realized her mistake and quietly backed down. Maybe this whole nightmare was just going to fade away without any more drama. Then on Monday morning, I checked my mailbox and found another letter, but this one wasn't from her. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, and the return address made my blood run cold. The letter was professionally printed on expensive letterhead, very formal, very serious, and it informed me that their client was pursuing legal action regarding child support and parental obligations. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my responsibilities, referenced her pregnancy as established fact, mentioned amounts I'd be expected to contribute, and made it very clear that my refusal to cooperate was being documented. I read it standing in my living room, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt actual anger, not at the absurdity anymore, but at the deliberate escalation. She wasn't backing down, she was doubling down, and she'd brought lawyers into something that could have been resolved with one honest conversation. I called my own attorney that same day, a guy I'd used for some contract work a few years back, and I laid out the entire situation for him. His first question was whether I had documentation of my condition, and when I said yes, complete medical records, he actually laughed and said this was the easiest case he'd ever seen. But then he added something that made me pause. The question wasn't whether I'd win, it was what her endgame was, what she actually thought would happen when the truth came out, because it absolutely would come out. This first part of the story shows us something critical. How manipulators often rely on their targets not having evidence to defend themselves. Our narrator's calm, methodical approach of gathering documentation before responding emotionally probably saved him from making mistakes that could have complicated things later. Notice how she escalated to lawyers immediately after receiving medical proof, which suggests this wasn't a confused mistake, but a calculated gamble that failed. The lawyer's letter sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I did anything with it. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted to make absolutely sure I handled this perfectly. My attorney told me to gather everything: emails, texts, medical records, anything that could establish a timeline. And while I was digging through old messages, I started noticing things I'd missed before. About 4 months before our breakup, her texting patterns had changed completely. She'd go hours without responding when she used to reply within minutes. And there were entire evenings where she claimed to be working late, but her social media showed she was out somewhere else. Looking back now with fresh eyes, I could see other signs too. She'd seemed tired more often those last few months, made excuses about feeling sick that I'd chalked up to stress from our failing relationship, even started wearing looser clothes that I'd barely registered at the time. At the time, I'd attributed everything to us growing apart, natural relationship decay, but now those gaps felt different. Now they felt like something I should have paid more attention to. I took screenshots of everything, organized them by date, and sent the whole package to my attorney with a note asking what our next move should be. He called me back within an hour and said we were going to send her lawyers something they definitely weren't expecting: complete medical documentation proving biological impossibility, treatment records going back 20 years, and 3 separate lab reports, all saying the same thing. The response we sent was clinical and devastating. No emotion, no accusations, just pure medical fact laid out in language even a first-year law student couldn't misinterpret. We included a letter from my oncologist explaining the treatment I'd received, the permanent effects on fertility, and a statement confirming that natural conception was impossible in my case. My attorney added a paragraph that I particularly appreciated. It basically said that any further attempts to pursue paternity claims would be considered fraudulent and could result in legal consequences for filing false documents. We sent it certified mail to her lawyers, regular mail to her apartment, and copied her on the email version just to make absolutely certain nobody could claim they didn't receive it. Then I waited, expecting maybe a quick retraction, maybe an embarrassed phone call, maybe just silence while they figured out how to back down gracefully. What I got instead was something I genuinely didn't see coming. Absolute radio silence. The kind of silence that feels louder than any argument. 3 weeks went by with nothing, no response from her attorneys, no angry messages from her, not even a passive-aggressive social media post that I could screenshot for documentation. My attorney said this was actually a good sign, that they were probably trying to figure out how to withdraw without admitting wrongdoing, but something about it felt off to me. People like my ex didn't just slink away quietly when their plans collapsed. They adapted, they found new angles, they burned everything down rather than admit defeat. I kept checking my email obsessively, kept looking at my phone expecting some new crisis, and the waiting was honestly worse than the initial confrontation had been. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize asking if we could talk about what she'd done to me. The message was from her younger sister, someone I'd met maybe 5 times during our relationship, someone who'd always seemed nice but distant. I debated whether to respond at all, whether this was some kind of trap, but curiosity won out, and I agreed to meet her for coffee the next day. She showed up looking exhausted, like she hadn't slept properly in days, and before I could even say hello, she started apologizing for her sister's behavior. Apparently, the whole family had been in crisis mode ever since my medical records arrived. Her parents had already started buying baby furniture and telling their friends about becoming grandparents. And now everyone was trying to process the fact that their daughter had lied about something this massive. I asked if she'd told them who the actual father was, keeping my voice neutral, and her sister just shook her head and said nobody could get a straight answer. But then she added something interesting. About 8 months ago, right around when those texting gaps and behavioral changes started, my ex had gotten weirdly close with someone from her office, a guy she'd mentioned a few times as just a work friend. Her sister had met him once at some company happy hour, remembered thinking it was strange how much time they spent talking in the corner, but she'd figured it was innocent because the guy was married with kids. The way she emphasized that he had been married made my stomach sink, because I could already see where this was going, could already predict the explosion that was coming for people who had nothing to do with me. I thanked her sister for the information, told her I appreciated her honesty, and went home to document everything she'd told me. That same evening, my ex tried a different approach. She started calling my landlord, leaving messages about how I was an unfit tenant who harassed pregnant women, trying to get me evicted from my apartment. My landlord, bless him, called me immediately to ask what kind of drama I'd gotten into, and when I explained the situation and offered to show him the legal correspondence, he just laughed and said he'd dealt with vengeful exes before. He mentioned she'd called 3 times that day and asked me to send him something in writing so he could tell her to stop. I emailed him a brief summary and copies of the relevant documents, and he forwarded them to his attorney with a note saying if she contacted him again, they'd pursue harassment charges. But she wasn't done yet, not even close. While she was trying to destroy my housing situation, she was also apparently running a completely different scheme at her workplace. One of my friends who worked in the same industry sent me a screenshot of a fundraiser that had been circulating through her company's internal channels. The description was heartbreaking if you didn't know the truth. Single mother abandoned by her partner, struggling to afford prenatal care, just trying to give her baby a good start in life. People had donated, not huge amounts, but enough that it probably added up to a few $1,000s. And the comments were full of supportive messages calling me every name you could imagine. My friend said the company's HR department had gotten involved once someone questioned why she was soliciting money at work, but by then the damage was done, the narrative was set, and I was the villain in a story I didn't even know was being told. I felt this weird mix of anger and exhaustion, like every time I thought we'd reached the bottom of this situation, she found a new way to dig deeper. My attorney said we could potentially pursue defamation claims, but he also pointed out that sometimes the best response is just letting someone destroy their own credibility, and in this case, that's exactly what was happening. The real breaking point came from a direction nobody expected. The married coworker's wife started asking questions. Apparently, my ex had been sending him increasingly frantic messages, begging him to step up and help with the baby, threatening to tell his wife everything if he didn't, and she'd made the crucial mistake of sending one of those messages while his phone was sitting on the kitchen counter and his wife was standing right there. The wife confronted him. He apparently crumbled immediately and confessed to an 8-month affair, and their entire marriage imploded in the span of a single evening. But here's where it gets messy. The wife wasn't content to just divorce him quietly. She wanted everyone to know exactly why their family was falling apart, and she had screenshots of every message my ex had sent. She posted them in a private Facebook group for parents at their kids' school. Someone from that group worked at my ex's company, and within 48 hours the entire office knew the real story. The fundraiser got shut down. HR launched an investigation into whether company resources had been misused, and suddenly my ex went from sympathetic victim to office pariah in record time. My attorney called me on a Friday afternoon with news that felt almost anticlimactic after everything else. Her lawyers had sent a formal letter withdrawing all claims and stating that the initial petition had been filed in error. No apology, no acknowledgement of the chaos they'd caused, just a sterile legal statement basically saying they'd made a mistake. He asked if I wanted to push for anything else, maybe a formal retraction or a settlement to cover my legal fees, but honestly, I just wanted it over. Let it go, I told him. Let her deal with the consequences she created. He agreed, but suggested I keep all the documentation indefinitely, just in case she tried something else down the road. I organized everything into a folder on my computer, backed it up in 3 different places, and tried to figure out how to move forward from something this bizarre. But the story apparently wasn't quite finished yet, because 2 weeks later I got one more message that showed me exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. In this part, we witnessed a classic pattern of escalation when manipulation fails, attacking the person's livelihood, reputation, and housing. What's particularly telling is how quickly her story fell apart once a third party with actual evidence got involved. The coworker's wife didn't set out to help our narrator, but her desire for truth and accountability ended up exposing the entire scheme. This demonstrates why manipulators prefer to operate in isolation where they control the narrative. The message came through LinkedIn of all places, and it was from the coworker's now ex-wife, the woman whose marriage had exploded because of my ex's threats and desperation. She apologized for reaching out, but said she thought I deserved to know what had actually happened, and what she told me filled in the gaps I'd been missing. She'd gone through every message on her husband's phone after his confession, thousands of texts spanning months, and the picture they painted was ugly. My ex had pursued him aggressively from the start, knew he was married from day one, and had apparently told him I was emotionally abusive and controlling to justify the whole thing. They'd been meeting during those convenient late work nights and weekend office emergencies that I'd been too trusting to question. The guy had apparently been stringing her along the whole time, making promises he never intended to keep, and when she got pregnant he'd panicked and tried to end things. That's when the threats started. That's when she told him she'd destroy his marriage if he didn't step up. And that's apparently also when she decided I might be a more convenient option for child support than a messy custody battle with a married man who wanted nothing to do with her. The ex-wife didn't send me all the screenshots, just described what she'd found, but it was enough to understand the timeline. In messages from about a month before our breakup, my ex had told this guy she was going to end things with me soon, but needed to time it right so I wouldn't get suspicious. In others sent 2 weeks after our breakup, she told him she was free now and they could finally be together openly, and his response was basically that he'd never promised her anything serious. The pregnancy announcement to him came about a month later, and his reaction was pure panic, accusing her of trying to trap him, saying he'd never leave his wife and kids. That's when she apparently pivoted to Plan B, which was pinning the whole thing on me, banking on the fact that I'd been her boyfriend recently enough that it could seem plausible. What she hadn't counted on was me having ironclad medical proof that made her entire story impossible, and she definitely hadn't expected her backup plan to collapse so spectacularly when his wife found those messages. The fallout at her workplace became impossible to contain once HR started their investigation. The fundraiser she'd organized violated company policy about using internal systems for personal gain, and several employees had complained about the situation once the truth came out. Her company didn't fire her outright, probably worried about wrongful termination claims since she was pregnant, but they transferred her to a different department with no client contact and made it clear her career advancement there was finished. The coworker got fired immediately though, something about his affair violating the company's ethics policy since they'd been meeting up during work hours and using company resources. His divorce moved forward fast. His ex-wife had hired an aggressive attorney, and those screenshots made any custody negotiation pretty one-sided. And from what I heard, he ended up in a studio apartment paying most of his salary in child support and alimony. I felt bad for his kids. Honestly, they were innocent victims in all of this, but I couldn't muster much sympathy for him or my ex at that point. About a month after the legal case got withdrawn, my ex made one final attempt at damage control. She sent me an email, not through lawyers this time, just a direct message that was somehow both apologetic and demanding at the same time. She acknowledged that maybe she'd made some mistakes in how she handled things, said the stress of the pregnancy had made her act irrationally, and then got to her real point. She needed financial help. The number was so specific it was almost funny, like she'd calculated exactly what she thought she could squeeze out of me, $15,000 as a one-time payment. She claimed it would cover her medical expenses and help her get settled before the baby came. And she promised that if I gave it to her, she'd sign anything I wanted, confirming I had no legal obligation to the child. The email ended with what I guess she thought was a compelling argument, that helping her was the right thing to do given our history together, that she was scared and alone, and that this was my chance to be the bigger person. I forwarded the email to my attorney without responding to her, and his reply was brief and perfect. He sent her a formal letter stating that I would not be providing any financial support, that any further contact would be considered harassment, and that we retained all documentation of her fraudulent paternity claims should she attempt any future legal action. He didn't threaten her exactly, but the implication was clear. She'd already destroyed her own credibility, and any attempt to come after me again would just make things worse for her. After that letter, the silence was finally permanent. No more emails, no more letters, no attempts to contact me through mutual friends or family members. I changed my phone number anyway, blocked her on every social media platform I could think of, and made it clear to the few people we both knew that I didn't want updates about her life or situation. About 7 months later, the coworker's ex-wife sent me one final brief message. My ex had given birth to a boy. She was living with her parents because she couldn't afford her own place anymore, and the coworker had signed away his parental rights rather than deal with custody arrangements, though he was still legally obligated for child support. Apparently, he'd wanted nothing to do with the situation, and his divorce settlement actually included a clause preventing contact with my ex to avoid further drama. The whole situation was messy and sad, a baby growing up in the wreckage of all these burned relationships, but it wasn't my mess, and it wasn't my responsibility. I thanked her for the update, wished her well with her own recovery and moving forward, and closed that chapter of my life completely. Looking back now, the weirdest part isn't even the audacity of trying to pin a pregnancy on someone who's sterile. It's how close she came to making it work through pure manipulation and social pressure. If I hadn't had those medical records, if I hadn't kept every email and text, if I'd been the kind of person who just accepted responsibility without asking questions, I could have ended up legally obligated to a child that wasn't mine for the next 18 years. The cancer that took away my ability to have biological children ended up being the only thing that saved me from a lifetime of paying for someone else's choices. I don't talk about this story much in real life. It's not exactly casual conversation, but when I do tell people, the main thing I emphasize is this: document everything, trust, but verify, and never let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself with facts. My ex made her choices, burned every bridge she had, and created a situation where her kid would grow up knowing his mother tried to commit fraud, and those are consequences she'll live with forever, not me. The lesson here is simple. When someone pressures you to skip verification and just trust them, that's exactly when you need documentation most. Our narrator's medical condition was unique, but the principle is universal. Protect yourself with evidence, maintain boundaries even when called unreasonable, and remember that honest people don't rage when asked for proof. Now I want to hear from you. Would you have pursued defamation charges after that workplace fundraiser, or was letting her destroy her own credibility the smarter play? And the bigger question, did he have any moral obligation to help her financially despite the fraud, or does deliberate deception erase all responsibility? Drop your thoughts in the comments.